Hey, what's up everybody? My name's Alckemy. Welcome to the channel. Today we're going to be doing some cooking in Faceplant and just kind of most likely do some bass design, but just see where the sound wants to take us and hopefully come up with something cool. I don't know what this is going to sound like, but hopefully you could skip ahead to the end of the video to see if it's something that you're interested in, and I'm just going to have some fun like I did with episode 1. So a brand new update to Kilohertz came out, which I'm super excited for. That is a couple of things. One is the shaper and then the shaper table. So the wave shaper, if you haven't seen my other video, is a customizable wave shaper, and this is pretty significant because it allows custom distortion. It was actually one of the biggest complaints that I had regarding some other VSTs, but for this you have so many more possibilities for doing really cool stuff because you can literally make your own shapes. So I want to give you all some of you guys a cool shout out as well, because I had some common misconceptions about how I thought this worked, and I'm not going to go in and explain what a shaper does, but you can look up all the nerdy stuff. But really just playing around with the waveform and watching this from what something like a sine wave does. Say if we play a low sound here and then maybe turn this up. There we go. You can just kind of watch that there, and then turning this on and seeing how this creates new waveforms. Perhaps I should dip it down just a little bit so we can see what this is actually doing. There we go. You can see that just by a little bit of drive, how much fatter that sound has become. And so working with these kinds of things is extremely helpful in shaping sounds. Now, one other thing that I think is important to talk about is that shaper table is a wavetable distortion, but that doesn't mean that it's FM. So let me explain. I want to pull up maybe something very simple. For example, let's just go into something like a user thing, and let's pull up something that's relatively soft. So what I'm going to do is start from off, and then let's go ahead and start adding some drive. Now you can see here that this is actually focusing on the middle of the waveform here, and that's why you can rotate the phase. But if you also look over here on the right with what's happening with the waveform, you're going to see that it significantly changes the signal. You also have things like bias that move the waveform from the cycle, right? Because if you look at this shape here, you can see that it has this kind of curve that mimics this. And I think that, if I'm not mistaken, it only focuses on a certain part of the waveform where it meets the zero crossing. So if you look at here, there's the zero crossing, and then it can rotate it. But you see now this is very quiet because there's no zero crossing that's involved. Where the sound gets bigger now, gets quieter again, and whatnot. So this is important because this can have a huge impact on how this shapes the sound. And then the other thing that I think is important to discuss is that it is not the same as doing PM or FM respectively. PM and FM are very similar. Phase modulation versus frequency modulation, they kind of get to the same result, albeit a different algorithm, but you can just say that they're related. But just for the sake of being thorough, I want to pull this up and I want to actually apply some FM to the phase here and show you the difference of how that sounds. So the other thing with doing FM or PM, whatever you want to call it, from a wavetable here is that you also have the ability to shift the pitch and the harmonics. So where even if you were to set the drive to 100%, it still sounds aggressive, but hopefully you can tell that it's different, and also you can cycle through the wavetable as well. So, which is pretty interesting. But even if we leave this on the first harmonic and we set this to be really hard, see how much different of a timbre we've created through that? And so I don't know exactly what this does. And so rather than being wrong, I'm just going to flat out say I don't exactly know how this is shaping harmonics. But if I had to guess, it's adding distortion and harmonics through creating a mini shaper, as you can see within the window here, and using the wavetable or the waveform as is of wherever you place the bias and the center. So generally speaking, if you want to have something that has a balanced signal, so this is the second thing that I want to talk about, because if you apply too much distortion, then we can actually start to lose our fundamental. So check this out. See that? That's our that's our sub. That is our energy of the bass. But the more that you start to apply stuff, the more that it has the potential to change. So check this out. You see how now this is completely mid-heavy? Now let's go ahead and rotate the bias and see what's happening here. Sounds really cool, but we have no sub. And so my theory is that, again, the more that we get away from that zero crossing, there is a zero crossing in this. Let's go ahead and rotate the phase away from it. Yeah, so here. Oh, there it is. In which case, it's something to be mindful of, and it's not something to necessarily go from a Bible of or whatever, but notice that there is a relationship of how to figure out how this works. And so by utilizing a combination of both the oscilloscope and this here, which is kind of what we're going to be relying on while we're building stuff, is a very important aspect to how we start to build this sound as a whole. Now, my only issue is that I'm not really sure how I want to format this to where you can see everything from both sides. So perhaps what I can do is put this here and then maybe place this right under there. So that way, there we go. We might be able to kind of fit that in. Now, really the only thing that we need to watch for, that's the most important aspect of this, is making sure that that fundamental is prominent if we're talking about bass. So you also want to understand that if you look at an EQ here, it's non-linear, it's exponential. So look at the distance between this. We go from 20 to 30 to 50 to 100 to 150 to 200, 300, 500, 1000, 1500, 2K, 3K, 5K, 10K. So the more that we travel upon this frequency range, the more that it starts to like condense itself. And be mindful that the more that you squish this EQ, the more that it's going to kind of like redistribute the frequencies across this spectrum. So I haven't actually ever seen something that isn't maybe something that is actually just completely linear as opposed to exponential. But if anybody knows of an EQ that actually does that, I think that would be interesting to actually utilize EQ and filter shaping with, because obviously those mid highs and even what's going on between the lows and the mids are a very crucial part of bass shaping. So sorry, I know that was a lot of technical stuff and we haven't even started making sounds yet, but I think that this is a really cool way to just look at what we're actually seeing and also dictate how to actually use this and apply it within a sound itself. So I'm going to be doing a little bit of both. We'll probably turn this off for now. We're going to leave this on. And the first thing that I want to do is actually pull this wavetable back up. We can utilize this, but I'm going to set a random harmonic here and try to get something that sounds a little bit more screechy. So now I'm not really concerned about what pitch this is because I'm going to be adding another sub under here. As long as you see here from the get-go, we don't make this quite as loud. And I guess something that we can do as well is start to treat this and distort the bottom end of this. So now we've got a little bit more, and this is kind of cool because you see that there's an actual relationship now. I wonder if I play a higher pitch, if that's going to oscillate faster. Oh, it does. See that? How that's kind of interesting. So maybe if we were to turn this up. So something that I would like to see is if there is a way to make that movement more dramatic. So maybe we can try applying more FM. And I had no idea that we were going to get ourselves into this problem. It's just something that I want to look at. So it's only specific frequencies, and I wonder if I play a higher pitch. Nope, it's still there. So that's really interesting too, because within this, you'll notice that right now we have the pulsing over here. See that right here? But if we change this to something different, say this, then now it's gone. And I know that this is offbeat, or the harmonic is like incomplete and we're utilizing the in-between, but I think that it's kind of cool because this, most of the time when people are doing FM with harmonics, not all the time, but most of the time they're using complete harmonics of the harmonic series. If you don't know what the harmonic series is, if you open up a wavetable, you see here that you've got 1 all the way to 1000. Shout out to Databroth, because I had a small error when I was explaining this, that this is not the frequency range, this is the harmonic series. They look similar, but they are different. We can talk more about that maybe if we're going to make a wavetable or something later, but I'm not concerned with it right now. So, but interestingly, you can see that we're still getting some movement here. And keeping a higher harmonic separates itself more from the bass. What is right and wrong doesn't really matter, but I do think that's kind of interesting to consider. A little bit of sync is bringing up some of those lower harmonics. And then let's see what happens if we distort that. Interesting. So let's pull back off of the harmonic now. Sick. So now you can see we've got a really nice fundamental, and then we're getting this really nice separation here. So what I can maybe try to do is set this to saturate, give it a little bit more drive. That sounds really cool. It's actually not separating the sub more. You can always do this if you want to, but I tend to try not to do this unless if I'm filtering, because, well, what happens if you play another note? I guess something that we could do just for funsies is we can actually utilize this. So what I'll do is I'll grab a note and we will set this to 24. And we're going to set the root note of this to D#1. And I'm going to go to this peak right here, which is this one, and I'm going to set a range here of maybe something all the way to 150. And now I'm not really concerned with it being exact, but you can see here that we're kind of key tracking that now to make sure that the fundamental of this is being the most prominent part of the signal. Awesome. So let's go ahead and throw this here. And I'm going to use another slice EQ to kind of be mindful about what I'm doing. And what we can do as well is give this a little, no, because this is going to turn this up to be super loud. But now what we can do is we can watch this over in the bottom right corner. Sorry, let's pull that over here and look at what's happening. See how we lost all of the bass here? So maybe if we can set a bias on here, or maybe even turn the smooth up, that might, probably not, because this really is only meant to kind of make the waveform look like it's a more basic shape. So let's go ahead and open up the table now, because as you can see, all of these, no matter what I'm doing, is not creating any more, is not favoring the sub as much as I want it to. Now, this goes into a really important point whenever you're looking at this kind of stuff, because for one, the shaper table is new to me, and it's interesting to see like how this is affecting the sound, but this also goes into a really important piece of advice, which is build in stages. Build saturation, distortion in stages. And so as opposed to just turning this on and cranking this at 100%, oops, let's go back. What we can do is now maybe grab another shaper and see how this begins to affect the signal. So you can see here that there's a DC filter that's happening. I can't necessarily tell if there's a DC offset or not, but perhaps something that we can do is look at it. And that's why some of these tools are interesting, because if the waveform becomes asymmetrical, then it's not necessarily like a bad thing, but sometimes it can pull away from the energy of your tune or have an uneven division of the speaker pushing and pulling. I'm not really sure which one it is, but on one, if it's like positive, then the speaker is pushing, and if it's on the bottom, the speaker is pulling. But if it's only pushing out and you're not getting any pull, then you're not getting the full vibration of the full range of motion of the speaker, or at least that's how I understand it. So from what it looks like though, it seems like this waveform, if we're looking at it from an oscilloscope, is fine, even through here. So we can also change this as well. And we can reduce this. There we go. So hopefully that's a little bit slower and a little bit easier to read. So yeah, interesting. All right, so now building in stages, right? We need to keep this up, or we can kind of, oh, that was cool. We can kind of utilize this to see what the most prominent harmonic is. Looks like the bottom is, so we're okay. But as you can see, as we're starting to move into stuff like that, it's creating just a lot more power, a lot more energy. So what I want to do is maybe take a look at some of these waveforms and see if I can kind of figure out how to maintain the low end, but also bring up some of the mids and mid highs, because we'll process those in a bit. So this is nice, because we're getting this really cool oscillation. That's nice. So you see how we built like a customized Reese from this, right? And now that we have this, I'm kind of curious to see what would happen if we started adding, say, an LFO table, or we started changing the shape over this stuff. Maybe on just start with one, but this is how I sound design when I'm trying to be like mindful of things, because I'm not really worried about the end result. I'm using this as a means of exploring and being aware about how these effects are treating the other sounds in relation, or the other effects, I guess, because technically speaking, even FM is an effect. So as you can see, what's interesting is, look at this. But I wonder if that's going to follow the same shape as this. It is. Isn't that interesting? So in this particular case, you can see that automating this might not be the best choice. And the reason why is because we have lost our low end. Still got it. That's getting kind of close. And that's pretty much what we want right there. So that's a good amount. You know, when you're like, how much distortion do you apply? How much, how much of this? How do you dictate? Well, it's about what I'm trying to evoke, because if you listen to this, the do, 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 I want that to be very extremely, like very prominent. So one thing that we could do is we could also do a dip right here. And now because we've dipped the mids right here, if we were to maybe set this to key track as well to the same depth, so what is that? That's 23%. And we utilize this and we go click 23%. Then in theory, this should and so whenever we utilize pitch bends and stuff as well, this is also going to follow, which is one of the awesome things that I love about the kilohertz note follower, is that it's both key tracking and pitch bending, whereas a lot of other synths don't do that. So something that I'm curious about is I want to see if maybe I can slow that down. Awesome. So now that we have that, this is a great starting point, and we can always do more. So, you know, if we're talking about, to me, I wanted to control the Reese and figure out how to utilize the shaper tables in which to bring more out of that. But now that we have this formula that we like, and keep in mind too that like if you wanted to, you could always just set the detuning here, but the higher harmonics that you have on detuning, the less that you want to detune something in the first place. So just to give you an example, if I set this harmonic to 4, then I turn the detuning up, a very minimal amount is actually going to be a lot faster because the pitch is higher. Make sense? So we do have a sub here that's kind of keeping it this consistent, and something that you can also do is like a high pass if you wanted to, or something of the sort, or you could just utilize this as your sub if you really want to and set a detuning thing on here. But you can see here that it kind of changes the relationship. And there's not a right or wrong, because this sound is still really cool. It doesn't have as much of the movement that I would want in particular, but just know that like please don't look at this as in a right or wrong. It's about intention, about how you want this to turn out. The reason why I'm kind of dancing around doing like the quote unquote neuro processing and stuff is because generally that's like the least difficult thing to do. It's more about setting up your source and then getting into all the intricacies and stuff. But when you're using the shaper table, because that's kind of the brand new thing in general, we want to be mindful about what it is that we're processing. So why would we use shaper then if we have shaper table, right? Well, that's because shaper is a more traditional and much more easily like malleable thing. So I know that if I set an S curve on this, let's go ahead and open this up. This is going to not destroy the low end. It might not bring it up anymore, but I know that it is going to reinforce that harmonic. So check this out. We can also try these guys out, which creates a lot more noise. So that's something to be mindful of. But if we were to take this, and I think that we can set this to, that says freeform, but if we were to take just this, yeah, so it looks like you see how one side is affecting the other in opposition. Perhaps if I just take this guy, kind of like so, and then maybe I make this guy straight. Go mirror. Let's go symmetry. Something else that you might want to mess with too is going back to that detuning, or sorry, going back to the unison and then setting 0 detuning on this. Maybe just a tad. So when this is blue, you'll see that we're getting some phase cancellation now, which is okay. But yeah, that's it's like all over the place. Sounds pretty cool, but once you throw your processing through that, if it sounds like doo-doo, well, that's because we've lost our sub. So these are cool experimentations that we're running through, but I'm just kind of interested to see like what comes about from this. So that blue right there is still mono signal, so we're getting a little bit of stereo here, but it's still the most prominent frequency where this peaks up just a little bit. Okay, so I still think that a little bit of this and a little bit of that kind of has the signal that we want. We can do stereo shaping and stuff later. Interesting. And then what's cool is that we can do a mix of this, so we're getting some really nice like crunchy top end. Those are some really nice artifacts at the top. Something that I might want to do here is move this over just a bit. So once it gets to the very top, that third harmonic is overtaking it. And I wouldn't be so clinical about being like, oh, you have to make sure that the sub is blah, blah, blah. Because typically speaking, when you start doing this, you should have like a Fletcher-Munson curve anyways. But now that we have this, we can start to play around between all this stuff and see if we can find some kind of interaction behind all this movement, right? So, I mean, what happens if we start grabbing, you know, different kinds of LFOs, kind of like so, and maybe we can set these to be relatively slow. So, I don't know, like a 2/1, and then just utilize this and see what this does. So sometimes, even though it is taking away from the bass, you can get something that is kind of cool like that. Doesn't necessarily mean that you want to keep it, but you know, there's lots of different options to explore. So now we can kind of cook up with, I guess, you know, our normal way of doing things. Actually, let's do something not normal, because I think that it's very important to understand that, like, while rules are extremely helpful in figuring out how to make something work, sometimes you can ignore the rules and maybe just keep one specific parameter, which is actually this guy right here. This is a mid-side scoop, so it's not actually doing a cut, but that way if I want to pull the mix off of it, it still works. So if you do a low cut, even if you use the mix, it's not going to work, but this is the most important thing right here. The other multi-band stuff is just for a means of controlling the signal. So now that we have that on here, then it's pretty much, did I pull multipass up again? I meant to pull up snap heap, I'm sorry. We can kind of just go to town with different kinds of modulation and stuff. So some of the options that we have, which everything is already randomized and we have stuff set to macros, yeah, that should be fine. I don't really see a reason to do anything different, to be honest. But what we can do is maybe adjust the speed a little bit. That's at 150 bass. So maybe we can kind of pull that down, kind of pull that down. And then we can kind of mess with this later to see if we want to make stuff smooth. But yeah, so the first thing that I'm going to toss in here is one of these guys, and I'm going to make this bigger because I like to be a little bit more surgical with this kind of stuff. I'm going to boost around those low mids here and put a notch right next to it. And then the others after this, it's like kind of free game. It's really just trying to shape a vowel, kind of like so. And what matters more than this is not how many cool things you have, but being mindful of the frequency range of how far this goes. So maybe perhaps if we set something in there, this seems okay. Let's see what that does. Turn this on. You see how that just made a roar sound? So if we were to add in maybe some distortion. And this is the part where I kind of just check out because it doesn't matter. But maybe something that we could do is set some limitations on here and pull this down. Kind of like so. Maybe pull that up. We can utilize some short delay. Maybe a touch of convolution. More distortion. More filtering. Same thing, kind of just make weird and wonky shapes. Doesn't really matter. Something else I might do is I might grab one of these guys and just kind of cut that there and do both a combination of movement as well as pulling off of the mix. If you want to be clever, then something else that you can do is you can toss in another snap heap here. This is why I said this is the easy stuff, because you just start stacking effects, and this is how I get to a lot of things. Yeah, so you can use a filter and be like, okay, well, that's cool. So on this, we can make that kind of jump around, maybe like so. And then on this guy, we will adjust the mix. And what I want to do in particular is I actually want to set this to where it's off and then pull off of that here. So that way we're going to get a mix of different kinds of movement, and then maybe send that through a touch of overdrive. Turn the mix on. Okay, that convolver is just a little bit too much. So I want to look at this through a slice EQ and see what's happening now. You can see here that for the most part, we're still getting that mono sub, but it fluctuates obviously because of this guy. Sorry, not that guy, but the slice EQ that we were running through this. So don't be afraid to utilize this. And if you're really worried about it, then something that you can do is go like this, and then you can do a high-low split if you want to. Something that's like, sure, duplicate this and set this here with a sharp cut. And these are running in parallel, which is now running into the limiter. So if you're really worried about what's happening with your sub, but if I run this here, not that big of a difference. So one thing that does make a huge difference though when it comes into filtering, and something to be really mindful of, is what happens when you are going to use a nonlinear filter using a low pass, because that along with the low mid boost, those two are going to be the most prominent things that you work with whenever you are trying to shape sounds. It's kind of annoying because there's this balance of like using an OTT whenever you start doing high cutting, or low passing, for depending on where you come from or like what you mind or what you're into, I guess. But the thing is that if you have something like this, and maybe now we can turn that up and we're starting to utilize this, then sometimes when you get this closure of this is closing, but we're getting this low mid boost. It goes real, kind of like so. And those are the kinds of vowels and stuff that I like to try to shape. So. So something that we can experiment with now is maybe perhaps tossing an OTT on this. I'm going to do it before the final neuro chain, which is that mid-side thing, but we can see if we can bring some of those high frequencies back. NOTT is not my favorite. I think that it's serviceable, but it doesn't quite give me that bite that I'm looking for. And I've seen other people make custom OTTs, but I haven't studied the parameters enough and also the phase relationship in order to kind of get what I'm looking for, if that makes sense. But that being said, we can still utilize this. And one thing that we can do for good measure is toss a transient shaper on here and just clip it, leave it alone, just clip it. Yes, the limiter will technically limit it, but sometimes having just that will squarify and cut the tops off everything, which can sometimes be more pleasing. But yeah, now we can kind of just mess around. Okay, so something that I would like to do is, is that on there? I'm going to adjust this just a bit more. And what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to make this come down a lot more and give it just a little bit of resonance. All right, that's too much. We got to be careful with this one because even just a little bit of resonance makes it sound super like wow, and I don't really like that. So now just adjusting this and setting different parameters that might be a little bit more extreme could be helpful. And you see that these are kind of opening and closing and all that stuff, and that's really cool. You'll see that like I tend to favor boosting the first or the lowest part of the filter, and then I might have a couple of smaller boosts here and then lots of cuts. But that's because the higher you go up, this gets into danger territory. And just as a main philosophical approach, I try not to even go that high. It's all about the mids. That's something that Nolan Frequent, if you know him, taught me. And like it's one thing like understanding it of like, yeah, it's all about the mids, but it's another thing that's getting really deep into what's happening right now. Cool, so let's go ahead and toss that through another overdrive. And what we can do is kind of just play with some of this stuff and be like, all right, well, what does that sound like? Let's maybe make this a little bit faster. Something else that we can do is we can also play around with moving this off of smooth or having it be kind of like half and half. So let's see what that does. I'm kind of just messing around and Cool. So I like all this stuff, but the thing that I find to be the most interesting is that this still isn't really, how do you say, it's really not like cutting enough of the sound out for me. So maybe something that we can do is try a different filter, perhaps one that is able to kind of have a steeper slope, and see what that does. And then the relationships that I'm trying to build with this is like, I want them to have a more sense of dramatic movement. And now what we can also mess around with is placing these in different places to see if we can rearrange them to get something that's still cool. Obviously this is like, you know, broken, so it's not super interesting, but and now we can play around with different types of movement and stuff as well. So before, when I had this, something that we were doing was really making sure that the movement aspect of this was, you know, the phase oscillation and stuff was being where it needs to go. But keep in mind that, like, if you hear one cool thing within this, you can always toss it into a sampler and start to recreate that movement through looping the sampler. So there's different stuff to kind of consider, but a lot of times you're only maybe a couple of effects away from making this sound kind of where it wants to be. Like right now, I think that it sounds okay, and I like that we're getting some really growly sounds or whatever, but I'm wanting this to turn into something that's more of fatter and less mids. So, you know, that tells me if I want less mids, then maybe something that I should do is consider throwing in a notch filter. That's where the intention and stuff comes in, about being like, well, what do you like about the sound? What don't you like about the sound? So maybe perhaps by doing something right here, we can kind of get a little bit more interesting movement as this begins to kind of phase through all this stuff. Something that I'm trying to consider as well is, again, I'm trying to avoid the sub, which is over here on the left, and then not like cut too much of the high mids out, because again, this is like the sweet spot. So So now this sounds actually to me a lot more interesting, but maybe something to consider is that this is only biting through those low mids, and so the movement from the bottom might need a little bit of an extra push. So maybe we'll leave this one without the unison and it's kind of doing its own thing, but maybe if we change this one into a detuned waveform, then that will help us have the movement that I desire. Maybe not, but that's why I like doing this stuff from scratch. I feel like we're close. We might not be there yet, but let's keep going and see if we can get closer to that strong pulsing that I'm looking for. Cool. So again, we're still not there, but I need to take a step back to do a secondary experiment to where I want to see what happens if we have this and we utilize another wavetable here in which to apply some off FM to this. So sometimes doing it by unison is the way to go, but sometimes by doing it by shifting the harmonic is also going to give you a similar result. So let's take a listen. Sorry, the pitch bend is stuck. See? See how much more prominent that is now? Though I do suspect that we've lost. See that? So it's happening only on the higher frequency. So maybe if we move the waveform to something more simple. Sounds pretty cool. Still not quite what we're looking for. So. Maybe something that we could also try is instead of applying this to the phase, we can apply it to the shift. It's going to affect the signal slightly different. That's interesting. So let's go ahead and turn this back on. And again, we're boosting that low end on this. So let's see what that does. Cool. Let's go ahead and toss another slice EQ in here just for fun. And we're going to utilize some of this stuff here. Sometimes you never know. Perhaps also maybe tossing a notch in here as well. So we can just grab this guy and be like, let's toss one, boom, right there. See what that does. Again, you want to be careful with cuts because if you pull the cut away, it just becomes a notch. But you see how this can kind of characterize the sound, which I think is pretty interesting. Okay, I'm much happier with that now. So one thing that I would like to see within Faceplant is, for what it's worth, fuse compressor is my favorite kind of thing to pull something out and make it bigger. So now we can get into the other stuff. I mean, 99% of the design within this was Faceplant, but as a means of getting it like ready to use, something that I do often is just this because it just makes it sound huge. Pull the release up a little bit, we can utilize this, and we can kind of dip the low mids a little bit and maybe push the lows up. So listen to it without this. So now whenever we play with the pitch bending on here, because this would be utilized more so for an effect, that's why I'm not so concerned with the low end anymore. If I were to try to utilize this for something that would go directly in a track with MIDI and stuff, then I would be a little bit more mindful about what's happening with the low end because I know that I'd be playing notes. But this is just meant to be like, you know, You know, something like that of the sort. So let's go ahead and add in some saturation on this. That's starting to sound more like how I want it to. Now, one more thing that I think could be really cool with this is perhaps, I'm not really sure how I want to do this because there's a couple of different ways, but let's experiment with both just because I'm having fun and I hope you are too. We can do a couple of things here to where we can add a flanger, and I really want this to tear through this sound, like just be super like, oh yeah, see how much different that sounds now? Whew, that was magical. So again, one thing is like if you're going to try to make downbeat basses with this, or phrases, right? That's something to be mindful of as well, is that like now that we have all this crap, like there's so many different ways that we can actually utilize this in which to create something that is going to service us in the way that we need to. And what I mean by that is, let me do one quick experiment so that way I just want to see if it makes a difference or not, but I haven't actually tested this. Okay, a little bit, but let's go ahead and just set this here. Remember that we've got a limiter and we have a transient shaper on here. So as opposed to trying to get like just right, which I think is like 72% or something like that, what we can do now is shape an envelope with this in which to start creating our phrases. So actually, let's take one step back and say, okay, one really good check with this is to maybe perhaps have a macro. And we're going to take this all the way down to like like 100. We can label this as sub, and then we can say, okay, whenever, like, in order for me to see or to test the quality of this low end right here, and keep in mind that like sustained, it's not going to work out because we have movement on the low end, and we talk about movement on all the other videos, 5 stages of sound design, blah, blah, blah. It's important, but it's also like not, but you might want to take a piece of this and use that as your sub or use that as a hit. So let's take a listen and make sure that our sub is at least serviceable at some points of time. I think it's okay. And the other thing too is that if you want to have this and completely go into a like different direction, you can start to stack multiple fuse compressors. And now we're going to be basically doing what most people call sine compression, where, and what you can do with these other ones per se is start to boost these high ends. And now we're messing with a completely different bass. So I'm going to back off of that just a bit. But just know that that exists, and this is why it's important to be like, yo, we just spent an hour doing this or whatever. But like when you're talking about getting variations or you're talking about having different phrases and stuff, like don't be like, the patch, like I'm married to the patch. There's so much other stuff that you can do. Like toss in all the other effects, make your CPU explode. It's fine. It brings respect and glory to the sound designers of the Neuro field. Just kidding. But within this, I kind of lost my train of thought. Understanding that our low end is okay, so we can pull off of the sub. And now I feel like there was something else that I was going to do. Oh yeah, we were going to start to shape phrases with this. So we can use a multi-stage envelope. We can use an envelope, but let's just go ahead and make this into like your typical like donk, right? So we can set this cycle here to just off. And now we can utilize this and just set it to 100% because we know that it's not going to push too hard into the other stuff that we have going on. But cool. Okay, well, let's create a different phrase. now that we have something like that, we can also do different kinds of stuff as well. It's where we're like, we're going to set a small pitch bend like this. Set this to sync and set this to off. Right? Or we can double click on this, try to get rid of these. I do love this. It's sometimes a little difficult to mess with them, but we can go like here, create another thing here. That's not what I wanted to do, but that's okay. That's what I wanted to do. See what I'm saying? And then what you can do is like, I would recommend bouncing this out in audio, or if you've seen my tutorial or my faceplant patches, then you'll see that I've kind of done a lot of this for you. This isn't an advertisement, but just as a means of, hey, this is my philosophy into one specific bass or one specific thing. If we were to take a look at this, this is available at alchemy.com, but a lot of times when I get into the designing of my patches, most of the work actually comes from setting everything up. Let's use a different one. I always use Capybara. Setting stuff up like phrases, right? So that way, if we turn this on, then every time we hit a note on this, it's going to be something a little bit different, but that way you get more randomization, but still hopefully usable stuff that you can utilize for fills or for little plucks or whatever. But check this out. Right, so we're getting lots of different stuff that is changing and randomizing not only the attack, but also the decay of the movement here. And every time you hit it, it's going to do something a little bit different. So taking all that into account, you can utilize this with patches if you already have it, or within your own design. I know that I did some stuff inside of Snap Heap and Multipass or whatever the heck we used. I know I did some stuff on the outside, but I didn't plan this. I had no idea what I was going to make today. So yeah, hopefully that was interesting to you. These are a lot of fun to do, and I like to just be like, hey, let's do some shit from scratch, because I don't like being that person that's like, look, I made something really cool, copy the patch. Like, you can't. Even if you try to remake this, like, it's not going to happen, because you have to get into the comfort of experimentation, and you also need to pick a point to deviate off of and make something completely different. So I don't know if you took nothing else from this video. I don't really know, because a lot of stuff like had to start lining up. I think that the big thing is, for one, just having fun and Bob Rossing this, but the other thing is kind of being mindful about listening to the sound and where you want it to go. And that's something that I can show you via this demonstration or whatever, but it's something that you kind of have to start like lending on your ear for certain things that peek out to you that you like. And hopefully it's going to build your awareness whenever you're doing your own sound design, to be like, hey, this is what I have to do in order to get the sound from being kind of cool to, that's what I'm talking about. That's the sound that I'm like, yeah, that's sick. So anyways, I'm going to save this patch. It'll be available for all the ARCANUM members. Hopefully that's something that, just a small way to show appreciation for everything that you all do for me. If you want to check out my presets, alchemy.com. Anything else? Lessons? I'm really overdue for putting music out. I've got a lot of music that's like technically done, but if you're interested, buy my album. Albums, EPs, whatever. Yeah, I'm working on it. Much love, guys. Have an awesome rest of your evening. I will see you probably tomorrow or Saturday or whenever it's time to be online. I'm always online. Bye, guys.